equity is.
Today on our podcast, we have Dr. Sabriya K. Jubilee. Dr. Sabriya K. Jubilee is the Deputy Chief of Equity. In this role, she provides leadership and guidance in the development, implementation, and evaluation of the district's equity work at large, and specifically the evolution of the School District of Philadelphia Equity Coalition in partnership with the Executive Director and Coalition Subcommittee co-leads. Prior to this role, she served as the Executive Director of School Improvement. She holds degrees from Virginia Tech, The Ohio State University, Gwynedd Mercy University, and Temple University. She is a native of Philadelphia and a graduate of the district, and is preparing to celebrate her 11th year at School District of Philadelphia this July. Hello and welcome to our second episode of Equity Is. I have with me Dr. Sabriya K. Jubilee. We can get right into the questions, Dr. Jubilee, and thank you once again in honor of National Women's Month for agreeing to this interview. So if you don't mind, we'll get started.
Yes, looking forward to it. Thank you for having me.
So the first question we want to know, since it is Women's Month, is what does feminism mean to you?
It's a good question, Dara. So when I think about feminism, coming from my theoretical lens and background, there's so many different ways and considerations that we can think about. There's been waves of feminism. And when you think about feminism juxtaposed to womanism and Black womanism, there's all kinds of things and different points of departure that people have about it. But for me, at the core, feminism really speaks to centering the power and value of women, and to think about our spirit and all that that brings with being a woman. We are creators, we're nurturers, we're protectors, we provide the strength, we are seers, we are all the things that make humanity complete. And when I think about feminism, it is really about centering that and honoring that.
That's great. We hear a lot about the need for equity in education. And I'm curious, what do you see as the most challenging aspect of working towards a more equitable School District of Philadelphia? And what are some of the steps we all should be making to help in the progress of this work that I know is extremely important to you?
Yes, well, I'll do a shout out, shameless plug to the STP Equity Coalition, because it's one of our approaches to really doing this work from a collective space. But I think one of our most challenging areas that we face as a district, and this is my 11th year at the district, is this idea of building collective action and establishing the trust that's needed to really get deep with our equity work. So we are a very large system, and we have a very long history, both as a district and within the city at large, where people unfortunately have been hurt in ways that have been hard to bounce back from in some capacities. But one of the core steps that we must take in order to really do the heart work, and not the HARD, but the HEART, heart work of equity, is to get very personal about who we are and how that impacts the ways in which we show up. So for many of us, especially if we've ever been in a position of leadership, we've been taught that we conduct ourselves in certain ways in order to be successful as a leader. And I will say, under certain conditions, those survival techniques are absolutely necessary. But when we think about equity in its truest sense and the oneness that it brings, it requires us to move from a place of just thinking about who we are in terms of our positionality and being more vulnerable and actually being more loving as it relates to the ways in which we engage each other. Without that, our efforts will always be transactional. We will always be doing the program or setting the change in policy or thinking about this particular process, but we'll never actually get to the deep transformational components of equity that we desire and so need. When I think about equity from that perspective, it's really spiritual at its core, because it really gets to the hidden layers of humanity that we are often told have no space in the workplace.
Absolutely. And do you see this, do you see this when we deep dive into it? What about with women in particular in the workplace?
Yes, for sure. I think when you add on the layers of all of the identifiers, you're thinking about race, we really ground ourselves in the elements of race first. And then when you add the complexity of gender and sexual orientation and all the other things to that, it definitely compounds, I think, some of our ability to really stand up and be true to who we are as women, and to do that in a way that is respected and valued and is seen as the right pathway. There's a lot of ways that we're still hitting a lot of our first when we think about the accomplishments and achievement of women. And when you add race to that, is even worse. So definitely.
Thank you. This is a personal question to pose to you, but who is a woman that inspires you most and why?
Yeah, that question was interesting and very near to my heart, makes me smile. So I will say that I have the privilege of being poured into by several women throughout my life, from family members to my teachers at every level of schooling, all the way through college, church members, neighbors. But if I had to choose one, I would say the one who's responsible for me being on this earth, and that is my mother. So she passed away when I was 14 years old. She was just at the tender age of 38. But her presence, both pre and post her death, have had the greatest impact on my life to date. There's nothing that has been more significant in the shifting of my life from her demise. And I still, all the lessons and the ways in which that particular separation has happened literally has transformed the Sabriya who sits and stands today. But there are two things that I will share that she shared with me throughout my life that has definitely been key to helping me just navigate this world. She always used to tell me that life isn't fair, because as a kid, I wanted to do things and I would say, can I? And I was like, that's not fair. She always say, life isn't fair. And then she also taught me that God is sovereign. And so in those two elements, it was this idea of things are going to happen in your world existence as being a Black woman that you will absolutely have no control over. One of those elements being her death. But if you remember that God is sovereign, he created you, and that this element of who you are as a being and creature and creation of him will guide and keep you, then you'll be okay, even when those hurdles come. Now, she didn't give it to me in that sentence or in that package, but that's the lesson I extracted, both from her words and her lived experience. So hands down, my mommy, that's my woman.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Tell me your favorite thing about being a woman, and why is it your favorite thing? And it's kind of an interesting question because a lot of times we don't think about that aspect.
You're right. You're right. It is a good question. The thing that comes to mind, I think, is the complexity of our minds. I think about being a woman, we literally have the ability to think about multiple things, several things at one time. And sometimes that's to our detriment, but I think it also provides a level of dexterity and grace that I think is unique to being a woman. It makes me think about looking at some of my nieces and godchildren. And when you look at the little girls, you see that complexity very early. No one's taught them to do it. No one has said this is how you use your mind in multiple ways. It just happens. And I think if we can cultivate that in young women, it definitely builds a woman who understands herself and is able to understand herself in relationship to the world. And I think that complexity gives us both a depth and a breadth about our lived experiences. So I would say hands down the complexity of our minds.
Great. What are some assumptions or perceptions about women or women leaders that you find challenging or problematic? And would you like to change, or why would you change?
So I think when I think about that question in relationship to just myself as a leader, a Black woman in leadership, I think about the idea of being firm and leading from a place of confidence, being read as being angry or being unladylike. And it's definitely something that I've encountered in my experiences, and I know that of others who have mentored me along the way. But when I think about that, though, and the why of it, I think it's just people are intimidated by, and I don't want to get into like the male versus the female type of thing. This is not, we love our men, but people are intimidated by, I think, the confidence and the strength that women bring, and particularly women of color. But when we're able to tap into that element of ourselves, I think being a woman is about having strength. And so when that rises up, I feel like it's us operating in the fullest existence of who we are, kind of live and in living color. But it hasn't been valued the same way. So you always have to find a balance between being assertive and being confident while still trying to navigate the world that says when you do that, you are operating in the other category.
Absolutely. We've made progress, but realize that feminism as a movement still has work to accomplish. What do you believe will be the biggest challenge for the generation of women behind you?
These are all good questions, but this one I think hit me in my gut the most, because I think about the young women of today, of which a lot I've had honor and privilege to pour into and want to continue that as a part of my life's work. But I think their struggle, the hardest thing that they'll have is trying to find balance between what's real and what's fantasy. We have all had influences of imagery. We all, across generations, there's always been a model or several models of what women ought to be and do. But I think for this generation, there hasn't ever been this volume of imagery, and I'll say edited imagery, than what this group of young women are experiencing through social media. Now, social media has its place, I think, in life, and it definitely has been a tool. We've seen it in this pandemic quarantine of uniting us and connecting us in ways that we probably have never thought about. But without proper guidance, I also think that too much of those levels of influence can literally rob a young woman of her opportunity to really process self-awareness, this concept of identity development, and authenticity. I think one of the most powerful questions, and really they're kind of two-part questions that I've been able to ask myself as a woman, and I think when women can answer these things for, a woman can answer these things for herself, it is this concept of who am I and who do I want to be? When someone can come to, a woman can come to a place of understanding and an answer to that, she can accomplish anything. But to derive at a true response, it really takes time to reflect on life, to reflect on choices, to reflect on our minds, and to do the deep work, the deep self work to change or redirect behaviors or patterns that we don't want to keep or that no longer serve us. But you can't do that when you constantly have imagery bombarding you, and when you're faced with all the things that you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to look, what you're supposed to say, and not really have time to step back and say, does that really serve me? And is this what I want? So I think that this particular generation, this is why I think we, the women who are existing today, are very critical to their next level in development to help them balance that so that they can really begin to take what they want and take what serves them, but also be able to decipher between a real life and a fantasy. The heavy social media presence makes it very challenging to do that.
That's terrific. Thank you, Dr. Jubilee. Thank you so much. And if you could give me one word of what equity is to you, what would it be?
Restoration. So equity is restoration for me. And I chose the word restoration because restoration really speaks to bringing back something back to its original state and bringing it back to the fullest extent of why it was created and what it was intended to do. And so when I think about the concept of equity in that lens, it is about resetting what was originally intended for humanity. And that's that we all live in this world fully valued, fully appreciated, and fully able to actualize all of who we are. If we don't come to any levels of those levels of restoration, we never really achieve equity. And I said earlier in one of the questions that it's spiritual in nature. You really have to make the connections between our spirit and the humanity of life. And I see those things coming full circle when I think about equity as being restorative.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Again, that was Dr. Sabriya Jubilee. In honor of National Women's Month, we have a very strong woman that's leading change. And I thank you once again for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me.